The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George sat at his desk, staring at a piece of paper that seemed to mock him with its blank whiteness. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, had left him alone, to work on what she called a very special assignment, but George knew it was much more than homework. In just 2 weeks, he would stand before thousands of people and millions more watching on television to deliver his first official royal speech. The young prince ran his fingers through his sandy hair, a nervous habit he had picked up from his father. Outside his window, he could see the perfectly manicured gardens where he used to play without a care in the world. Those carefree days seemed like a distant memory now. Everything had changed 6 months ago when his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at Balmoral Castle. George remembered that September morning vividly. His mother, Catherine, had sat him down in the family's private sitting room, her eyes red from crying. She had explained that his great-grandmother had gone to heaven and that his grandfather, King Charles, was now the King of England. But what she said next had made George's stomach drop like a stone into deep water. "George, darling," his mother had said softly, "you're now second in line to the throne. This means you'll have new responsibilities, new duties that come with being a future king." At first, George hadn't fully understood what this meant. He was still just a boy who loved football, video games, and building model airplanes with his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. But as the months passed, the weight of his new position began to settle on his young shoulders, like a heavy winter coat. The palace staff began treating him differently. Instead of the casual Master George they used to call him, it was now, "Your Royal Highness," followed by formal bows. His schedule filled up with lessons about British history, constitutional law, and public speaking. The freedom he once enjoyed to run through the palace corridors was replaced with structured activities designed to prepare him for his future role. His parents, Prince William and Catherine, watched their eldest son's transformation with mixed emotions. They had both experienced the pressure of royal life, but they had been adults when they fully embraced their roles. George was still a child, trying to balance normal childhood experiences with the extraordinary expectations placed upon him. The upcoming speech was part of a new initiative by King Charles to gradually introduce the younger generation of royals to public life. George would be speaking at the opening ceremony of a new children's hospital in London, a cause close to his mother's heart. The hospital specialized in treating children with rare diseases, and many of the young patients there were George's age or younger. As George sat at his desk that morning, he thought about the children he would meet at the hospital. His private secretary had shown him photographs and told him their stories. There was Emma, an 8-year-old girl who had been battling leukemia for 2 years, but still smiled in every picture. There was Marcus, a 12-year-old boy who had lost his leg to bone cancer, but had learned to play football again with his prosthetic limb. There was little Sophie, only 6 years old, who had spent more time in hospitals than at home but drew beautiful pictures for the nurses who cared for her. These children and their families would be in the audience when he spoke. They had faced challenges that George couldn't even imagine, yet they continued to fight with courage and hope. How could he, a prince with every privilege in the world, find the right words to honor their strength and bring them comfort? George picked up his pen and began to write. His first attempts were stilted and formal, full of the royal language he had been learning in his lessons. "It is my great honor to address you today," he wrote, then crossed it out immediately. It sounded like something his grandfather might say, not the words of a 10-year-old boy speaking from his heart. He tried again. "Hello, everyone. My name is George." Better, but still not right. He crumpled up the paper and started fresh. Days passed, and George struggled with every sentence. His usually neat handwriting became messy as he wrote, crossed out, and rewrote his speech dozens of times. Mrs. Henderson offered to help, but George insisted he wanted to write it himself. This speech needed to come from him, not from adults telling him what to say. His siblings noticed his stress. Charlotte, wise beyond her 8 years, left encouraging notes under his bedroom door. "You're going to be brilliant, George. The children will love you," one note read. 7-year-old Louis, not fully understanding the pressure his brother was under, offered to share his favorite toy soldiers to help George feel braver. Prince William found his son in the palace library one evening, surrounded by crumpled papers and looking defeated. Without saying a word, William sat down beside George and put his arm around his shoulder. "I remember my first speech," William said quietly. "I was terrified. I thought everyone would see right through me and realize I had no idea what I was doing." George looked up at his father with surprise. "Really? But you always seem so confident when you speak." William smiled. "That's because I learned something important. The best speeches don't come from trying to sound impressive or royal. They come from being honest about who you are and why you care about something." That night, George lay in bed thinking about his father's words. He thought about the sick children he would meet, about their families who worried about them every day, about the doctors and nurses who dedicated their lives to helping them heal. He thought about his great-grandmother who had spent 70 years serving others before herself. Suddenly, George knew what he wanted to say. He quietly got out of bed, tiptoed to his desk, and began to write. This time, the words flowed naturally. He wasn't writing as a prince or a future king. He was writing as a 10-year-old boy who wanted to let other children know they weren't alone in their struggles. As he wrote, George felt something shift inside him. The nervousness was still there, but it was joined by something else: purpose. For the first time since learning about his new role, he began to understand what it truly meant to serve others. The following morning brought a new energy to Kensington Palace. Prince George woke up earlier than usual, feeling something he hadn't experienced in weeks, excitement mixed with his familiar nervousness. The speech he had written the night before lay on his desk, covered in his careful handwriting. For the first time, he felt like the words truly belonged to him. Mrs. Henderson arrived for their usual morning lesson to find George already dressed and waiting in the study. She noticed the completed speech on his desk and raised her eyebrows in pleasant surprise. "May I read it, Your Royal Highness?" she asked gently. George nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he handed her the papers. Mrs. Henderson had been his tutor for 3 years, and he trusted her judgment completely. She had a way of making even the most boring history lessons feel like exciting adventures. As she read, George watched her face carefully. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened, and when she finished, she removed her glasses to wipe away what George was surprised to see were tears. "George," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "this is beautiful. It's honest, it's heartfelt, and it's entirely you. But most importantly, it will mean the world to those children and their families." Relief flooded through George like warm sunshine after a storm. He had been so worried that his words weren't formal enough, weren't royal enough. But Mrs. Henderson's reaction told him he had found the right tone. Over the next few days, they worked together to polish the speech. Mrs. Henderson helped him with pronunciation and pacing, but she was careful not to change his words. The authenticity of his voice needed to remain intact. "Remember, George," she said during one of their practice sessions, "you're not performing for these people. You're sharing with them. There's a big difference." George practiced in front of different audiences. First, he read to Mrs. Henderson alone. Then his parents joined them. His mother, Catherine, listened with tears in her eyes, while his father nodded approvingly at particularly moving passages. Charlotte and Louis became his most enthusiastic audience, cheering at the end of each practice run. "You sound like a real prince now," Charlotte declared after one rehearsal, which made George both proud and nervous. The palace staff began to take notice too. Word spread quietly among the household that the young prince had written something special. The normally formal atmosphere around George became warmer, with staff members offering encouraging smiles and gentle words of support. One afternoon, King Charles himself arrived at Kensington Palace for an unscheduled visit. George felt his stomach tighten when he learned his grandfather wanted to hear the speech. The new king had always been kind to him, but George still felt the weight of Charles' expectations. They gathered in the same sitting room where George had first learned about his changing role. King Charles sat in his usual chair, his hands folded, his expression serious but not unkind. George's parents flanked him on either side, and Mrs. Henderson gave him an encouraging nod from the corner. George began to read, his voice shaking, slightly at first. But as he continued, his confidence grew. He found himself looking up from the paper more often, making eye contact with his grandfather. The words he had struggled with for so long now felt natural, like a conversation with a friend. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment that felt like an hour. King Charles stood up slowly and walked over to his grandson. George held his breath, expecting criticism or suggestions for improvement. Instead, his grandfather knelt down to George's eye level and placed both hands on his shoulders. "That," King Charles said quietly, "is exactly what this family should sound like. Not perfect, not distant, but real and caring. Your great-grandmother would be very proud." The mention of Queen Elizabeth made George's eyes well up with tears. He had been thinking about her while writing the speech, wondering what she would have wanted him to say. Knowing that his grandfather approved meant more than any amount of praise from strangers. As the day of the speech approached, George's nerves returned with a vengeance. He had nightmares about forgetting his words, about tripping on stage, about disappointing everyone who believed in him. His appetite disappeared, and dark circles formed under his eyes from restless nights. His mother noticed his declining state and decided to take action. One evening, she suggested they visit the hospital privately, before the official opening ceremony. "I think you should meet some of the children first," Catherine said. "Not as a prince giving a speech, but just as George. You might find that they're not so different from you." The next day, George and his mother slipped quietly into the children's hospital through a side entrance. They had arranged for a private tour with the head nurse, Mrs. Williams, a kind woman with silver hair and gentle eyes who had worked with sick children for over 30 years. "The children don't know you're coming," Mrs. Williams explained as they walked through the cheerfully decorated corridors. "We thought it would be more natural that way." Their first stop was the cancer ward, where George met Emma, the 8-year-old girl with leukemia he had seen in the photographs. She was sitting up in bed working on a jigsaw puzzle. When George and his mother entered her room, Emma looked up with curious eyes. "Hello," George said simply. "I'm George. What are you working on?" Emma smiled shyly. "It's a puzzle of a castle. Do you want to help?" For the next 20 minutes, George sat beside Emma's bed, helping her fit pieces together. They talked about school, about her favorite books, about the nurses who made her laugh even on difficult days. Emma never once mentioned that George was a prince, and George never mentioned his upcoming speech. They were just two children, sharing a quiet moment together. Similar scenes played out throughout the hospital. George played video games with Marcus, the boy who had lost his leg to cancer. He helped little Sophie color in her drawing book. He listened to teenagers talk about their dreams for the future, dreams that illness had not diminished. By the time they left the hospital, George felt transformed. These children weren't looking for royal grandeur or perfect speeches. They wanted to know that someone cared about them, that someone understood their struggles, and that someone believed in their strength. That night, George read through his speech one more time. The words that had once seemed so difficult now felt exactly right. He wasn't speaking as a prince to his subjects. He was speaking as one child to other children, offering them the support and recognition they deserved. The morning of the speech dawned gray and drizzly, matching the churning feeling in George's stomach. He had barely slept, despite his mother's attempts to calm his nerves with warm milk and gentle lullabies that seemed silly for a 10-year-old, but somehow still worked. At breakfast, George pushed his food around his plate without eating much. Charlotte tried to cheer him up by telling jokes, while Louis offered him half of his favorite strawberry jam. Even their efforts couldn't lift the heavy weight of anticipation that seemed to press down on George's shoulders. "I keep thinking about what could go wrong," George confided to his father as they sat together in the morning room. "What if I forget my words? What if my voice cracks? What if I start crying in front of everyone?" Prince William set down his newspaper and looked at his son with understanding eyes. "George, do you remember what happened when I first learned to ride a bicycle?" George shook his head, curious despite his nerves. "I was so afraid of falling that I refused to let go of the fence around the garden. I would ride along, holding on with one hand, convinced that the moment I let go I would crash. Your grandfather finally said something that changed everything. What did he say? He told me that the fence couldn't teach me balance, only falling, and getting back up could do that. The same is true for speeches, for leadership, for everything important in life. The magic happens when you let go and trust yourself. These words stayed with George as he prepared for the day. His valet helped him into his formal suit, a smaller version of what his father wore to official events. The navy blue fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar, but Mrs. Henderson had suggested he wear his favorite watch, a gift from Queen Elizabeth, to help him feel more like himself. The drive to the hospital took 30 minutes through London traffic. George sat between his parents in the back of the official car, watching ordinary people go about their daily lives. School children walked to classes, business people hurried to meetings, mothers pushed prams along sidewalks. None of them seemed nervous about speaking in public. George envied their normal, quiet lives. "Look, George," his mother pointed out the window. Along the route to the hospital, people had gathered on sidewalks and street corners. They waved British flags and held signs with messages like, "Good luck, Prince George," and "We believe in you." Children pressed their faces against shop windows to get a glimpse of the royal car. "They're all here for you," Catherine said softly. "They want you to succeed." But instead of feeling encouraged, George felt the pressure increase. These people had taken time from their busy lives to see him speak. What if he disappointed them? What if his speech wasn't good enough? As they arrived at the hospital, George could see the crowd that had gathered for the opening ceremony. Reporters with cameras lined the red carpet leading to the entrance. Hospital staff in their best uniforms stood at attention. Most importantly, patients and their families filled the temporary seating area that had been set up in the hospital's main courtyard. George recognized some faces from his private visit. There was Emma, sitting in a wheelchair but wearing a bright yellow dress that matched her smile. Marcus stood near the front, balancing confidently on his prosthetic leg. Little Sophie sat on her mother's lap, clutching the coloring book they had worked on together. "Remember," Mrs. Henderson whispered as they walked toward the podium, "you're not speaking to strangers, you're speaking to friends." The ceremony began with speeches from hospital administrators and local government officials. George barely heard their words. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. His palms grew sweaty, and he had to resist the urge to wipe them on his formal trousers. Finally, King Charles stepped up to the podium to introduce his grandson. The crowd grew quiet, hundreds of faces turning expectantly toward the small stage, where George would soon stand. "Ladies and gentlemen," King Charles began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone system. "It gives me great pleasure to introduce someone who represents the future of our monarchy and our nation. At just 10 years old, he has already shown remarkable compassion and wisdom beyond his years. Please welcome my grandson, His Royal Highness Prince George." The applause was thunderous. George felt his legs grow weak as he approached the podium. Someone had placed a small step behind it so he could reach the microphone, a detail that somehow made him feel even smaller and more exposed. He looked out at the sea of faces before him. In the front rows sat the children he had met during his private visit. Behind them were their families, many of whom had been living with worry and fear for months or years. Further back were hospital staff who dedicated their lives to healing others. In the very back were reporters and cameramen, ready to broadcast his words around the world. For a moment, George felt completely overwhelmed. His prepared speech seemed to disappear from his memory. His mouth felt dry and his hands shook as he reached for the microphone. Then something unexpected happened. Emma, the 8-year-old girl with leukemia, caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up. She mouthed the words, "You've got this," and smiled encouragingly. In that instant, George remembered why he was there. He wasn't there to impress adults or prove his worthiness as a future king. He was there to let these brave children know that someone saw their struggles, admired their courage, and wanted to help make their lives a little brighter. George took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. "Hello, everyone. My name is George, and I'm 10 years old, just like many of you here today." His voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger with each word. The crowd listened intently, parents leaning forward to catch every syllable. "A few days ago, I came to visit this hospital, and I met some of the most amazing people I've ever known. I met children who face challenges every day that most adults would find impossible. But instead of feeling sorry for themselves, they laugh with their nurses. They help other patients feel better, and they never give up hoping for tomorrow." George paused, looking directly at the children in the front rows. Several parents were already wiping away tears, but George continued, his confidence building with every sentence. "I used to think being brave meant not being scared. But after meeting all of you, I learned that real bravery means being scared and doing what you need to do anyway. Every one of you shows that kind of bravery every single day." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word from the young prince, who was speaking from his heart rather than from a script. George continued speaking, his voice growing steadier with each passing moment. The initial trembling had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet confidence that surprised even him. "When I first learned I would be giving this speech, I was terrified," he admitted honestly. "I thought about all the important people who would be listening, all the cameras that would be watching, and I felt like I might not be good enough. But then I realized something important. This speech isn't really about me at all." He gestured toward the children in the front rows, many of whom were now smiling back at him with recognition and warmth. "This speech is about Emma, who taught me that having cancer doesn't mean you can't still love jigsaw puzzles and dream about visiting castles. It's about Marcus, who showed me that losing a leg doesn't mean you have to stop playing the sport you love. It's about Sophie, who proved to me that even when you're only 6 years old and spending most of your time in hospitals, you can still create beautiful art that makes everyone around you smile." Parents throughout the audience were reaching for tissues. Several nurses who had worked with these children for months were openly crying. Even the usually stoic hospital administrators seemed moved by the young prince's words. "My great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, once told me that being royal isn't about wearing crowns or living in palaces. She said being royal means serving others, especially those who need help the most. Today I want to serve you by making sure everyone knows how incredibly special you are." George's voice caught slightly as he mentioned his great-grandmother, but he took a breath and continued. "To all the children here today who are fighting illnesses, I want you to know that you are my heroes. You wake up every morning and face things that would scare grown-ups. You smile even when you don't feel well. You comfort your parents when they're worried about you. You are stronger and braver than any superhero I've ever read about in comic books." Little Sophie clapped her hands excitedly at the mention of superheroes, causing a ripple of gentle laughter through the crowd. George smiled at her reaction before continuing. "To the parents and families here today, I see how much you love your children. I see how you stay strong for them even when you're scared inside. My mom and dad have taught me that families are strongest when they support each other through difficult times. You are all showing the world what real love looks like." Catherine, watching from the side of the stage, felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She had never been more proud of her eldest son. He had found his voice not through royal training or formal education, but through genuine connection with others. "And to the doctors, nurses, and everyone who works here at this amazing hospital," George continued, "thank you for dedicating your lives to helping children get better. You are angels in scrubs and white coats. You make scary places feel safer, and you give hope to families when they need it most." The hospital staff members in the audience beamed with pride. Many of them worked long hours for modest pay, often going unrecognized for their dedication. To hear their work acknowledged by a member of the royal family meant more than they could have imagined. George paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts for the most important part of his speech. "This new hospital wing that we're opening today will help even more children get the care they need. It has the most modern equipment, the brightest rooms, and spaces where families can stay close to their loved ones. But the most important thing about this place isn't the building or the machines. It's the hope it represents." His voice grew stronger as he approached his conclusion. "Hope that every child deserves the best possible chance to get well. Hope that families will never have to face these challenges alone. Hope that caring people will always be there to help when help is needed most." George looked directly at Emma, Marcus, Sophie, and the other children he had met during his private visit. I promise you that this won't be the last time I visit this hospital. I want to keep learning from all of you. I want to keep hearing your stories, seeing your art projects, and maybe even losing to you at video games. This comment brought genuine laughter from the children, who remembered how thoroughly Marcus had beaten the prince at his favorite racing game. Before I finish, I want to share something my father told me this morning. He said that real magic happens when you let go of your fears and trust yourself. Today, all of you are creating magic. You're showing the world that illness can't stop determination, that pain can't defeat hope, and that even the smallest person can make the biggest difference. George's final words were spoken with a maturity that seemed far beyond his 10 years. So to everyone here today, to everyone watching at home, and to everyone everywhere who might be facing their own challenges, remember that you are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and more loved than you know. Thank you for teaching me what courage really means. Thank you for letting me be part of your incredible stories. And thank you for showing me that the best way to serve others is simply to see them, to listen to them, and to let them know they matter. As George stepped back from the microphone, the courtyard erupted in applause. But this wasn't the polite, measured clapping typical of royal events. This was thunderous, heartfelt appreciation from people who had been genuinely moved by his words. Emma was the first to stand up, clapping her hands above her head despite the IV tube attached to her arm. Marcus jumped to his feet, using his crutches for support but managing to whistle loudly through his fingers. Sophie bounced excitedly on her mother's lap, calling out, "Good job, Prince George." Soon the entire audience was on their feet. Parents, who had been holding back tears, now let them flow freely. Hospital staff members applauded not just for the speech, but for the recognition George had given their work. Even the usually reserved reporters and camera operators seemed caught up in the emotional moment. King Charles stepped forward to embrace his grandson, his own eyes misty with pride. "Well done, George," he whispered. "Your great-grandmother would be so very proud." Prince William and Catherine rushed onto the stage to hug their son. In that moment, they weren't royalty participating in an official ceremony. They were simply parents overwhelmed with love and admiration for their child, who had just shown wisdom and compassion far beyond his years. The standing ovation seemed to last forever, but George barely noticed the applause anymore. His attention was focused entirely on the faces in the crowd, particularly the children who had inspired his words. He could see the joy and pride in their expressions, and something inside him shifted permanently. For the first time in his young life, he truly understood what it meant to use his position to make a difference. As the applause finally began to die down, George was surprised to see Emma raising her hand from her wheelchair. The crowd noticed too and gradually fell silent, curious about what the 8-year-old wanted to say. "Prince George," Emma called out in a clear voice that carried across the courtyard. "You said we're your heroes, but I think you're pretty heroic, too. Thank you for seeing us not as sick kids, but just as kids." Her simple words triggered another wave of emotion through the audience. George felt his throat tighten with gratitude. He had worried so much about saying the right thing, but Emma's response showed him that the most important thing was to speak from the heart. After the formal ceremony concluded, George spent time meeting individually with patients and their families. The royal protocol team had scheduled 15 minutes for this, but George ignored their subtle attempts to move him along. He was genuinely interested in hearing each child's story. He sat with 10-year-old James, who was recovering from a rare brain tumor surgery. James showed George the get-well cards he had received from his entire school class, including one from a boy who had previously bullied him. "Funny how being sick changes everything," James said with wisdom that surprised George. "People who never talked to me before now want to be my friend. I guess they realize that being mean doesn't matter when someone might not be around forever." George listened carefully, understanding that James was sharing something profound about human nature. "Do you think they'll stay friends when you get better?" he asked. James shrugged. "Some will, some won't. But at least I know who really cares about me now." Next, George met Sarah, a teenage girl who had been battling a rare autoimmune disease for 3 years. Unlike the younger children, Sarah seemed initially skeptical of the royal visit. "No offense, Prince George," she said directly, "but lots of important people come here, make speeches, and then we never see them again. How do we know you're different?" George appreciated her honesty. "You don't," he replied simply. "I can make promises, but words are easy. I guess you'll only know if I'm different by whether I actually come back and keep being involved." Sarah studied his face carefully. "Fair enough. I hope you do come back. These kids need people to remember them after the cameras go away." Her challenge stayed with George throughout the rest of his visit. By the time he returned to the car, he had made a private decision. This wouldn't be a one-time royal engagement for him. He wanted to find ways to stay connected to these children and this cause. The ride back to Kensington Palace was filled with excited chatter from his parents and Mrs. Henderson, all praising his performance. But George was quiet, processing everything he had experienced. The nervous 10-year-old who had left the palace that morning felt like a different person from the one returning home. That evening, news coverage of George's speech dominated television broadcasts across Britain and around the world. The BBC played the entire speech unedited, something rarely done for royal events. Social media exploded with positive reactions, with hashtags like Prince George Inspires and Royal Compassion trending worldwide. But the most meaningful reactions came from unexpected places. Children from hospitals across the country began sending letters to Kensington Palace, sharing their own stories and thanking George for understanding their experiences. Teachers reported that their students were discussing the speech and asking thoughtful questions about empathy and service to others. One letter particularly touched George's heart. It came from a 12-year-old girl named Katie in Scotland who had watched the speech from her own hospital bed. "Dear Prince George," she wrote in careful handwriting, "I have cystic fibrosis, and I've been in hospitals a lot like the kids you met. When you talked about us being superheroes, it was the first time anyone ever made me feel proud instead of sorry for being sick. My mom cried happy tears, and my dad said you give him hope for the future of our country. Thank you for making us feel seen." Reading Katie's letter and dozens of others like it, George realized that his speech had created something much bigger than he had intended. Children across the country who faced health challenges now felt acknowledged and valued. Parents felt hope. Healthcare workers felt appreciated. More importantly, George had discovered something about himself. The fears that had consumed him. Before, the speech seemed trivial now compared to the fear these children faced every day. If they could show such courage in the face of life-threatening illnesses, surely he could handle the pressures of public speaking and royal duties. 3 weeks after the hospital opening, George made good on his promise to return. This time, there were no cameras, no reporters, and no formal ceremony. He simply arrived with his mother for what the hospital staff called a friendship visit. George spent the afternoon playing board games, helping with art projects, and listening to stories. Emma showed him her completed castle puzzle, now framed and hanging on her hospital room wall. Marcus had learned some new tricks with his prosthetic leg and gave George a demonstration. Sophie had drawn a picture of the two of them coloring together, which she proudly presented to him as a gift. But the most significant moment came when George met a new patient, a 9-year-old boy named Alex who had just been diagnosed with leukemia. Alex was scared, angry, and refusing to talk to anyone. George sat quietly beside Alex's bed for several minutes without saying anything. Finally, Alex looked up and asked, "Are you that prince who gave the speech?" "I'm George," he replied simply. "My mom made me watch your speech. She said you understand about being scared." "I do understand that," George confirmed. "Being scared is normal when everything feels different and uncertain." Alex was quiet for a moment. "Do you think I'll be brave like the other kids here?" George smiled. "I think you already are brave. You're here, aren't you? You're facing something really difficult and you haven't given up. That's exactly what bravery looks like." For the first time since his diagnosis, Alex smiled. As George prepared to leave the hospital that day, Mrs. Williams, the head nurse, pulled him aside. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly, "in 30 years of working with sick children, I've seen many important visitors come and go. but I've never seen anyone connect with our patients the way you do. You have a gift for making people feel truly seen and valued." George blushed at the praise, but Mrs. Williams wasn't finished. "More than that, you've changed something in this hospital. The children talk about your visit constantly. They're more hopeful, more proud of themselves. Several parents have told me that their children's attitudes have completely transformed since hearing your speech." That night, as George wrote in the journal Mrs. Henderson had suggested he keep, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrifying morning when he first tried to write his speech. 6 months had passed since George's first speech, and the impact continued to ripple outward in ways that surprised everyone, including George himself. What had started as a terrifying obligation had transformed into something he genuinely looked forward to: regular visits to children's hospitals across the United Kingdom. The royal household had received over 10,000 letters from children, parents, and healthcare workers, all expressing gratitude for George's words and ongoing commitment. King Charles had decided to establish a new initiative called the Prince George Foundation for Young Courage, dedicated to supporting children facing serious health challenges and recognizing the healthcare workers who cared for them. George Dioub had mixed feelings about having a foundation named after him. On one hand, he was proud that his speech had led to something that could help more children. On the other hand, he worried that people might think he was trying to be more important than he was. "Grandpa," George said during one of their regular, weekly tea sessions, "I don't want people to think I'm showing off or pretending to be more grown-up than I am." King Charles smiled at his grandson's concern. "George, the best leaders are always worried about their motives. The fact that you're concerned about showing off proves that you're not. You're simply using your position to help others, which is exactly what royalty should do." The foundation's first major project was creating comfort rooms in children's hospitals across the country. These were spaces designed specifically for families with comfortable furniture, small kitchenettes, and quiet areas where parents could rest while staying close to their sick children. The idea had come from George himself, after he noticed during his hospital visits how exhausted and uncomfortable many parents looked as they tried to sleep in hard plastic chairs beside their children's beds. George had also convinced his parents to let him start writing a regular blog on the royal family's website. His posts were simple and honest, sharing stories about his hospital visits and the remarkable children he met. The blog, titled Letters from George, became one of the most popular sections of the royal website, with readers from around the world following his updates. One of his most popular posts described his friendship with Emma, the girl with leukemia, who had given him courage during his first speech. "Emma finished her treatment last month and her doctors say she's doing really well. When I visited her at home for the first time, she showed me the garden where she's growing vegetables. She told me that during her sickest days in the hospital, she would close her eyes and imagine planting seeds and watching them grow. Now that she's better, she's making those dreams come true. Emma taught me that hope isn't just wishing for good things to happen. Hope is believing in tomorrow even when today is really difficult." The blog post received thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of hope and perseverance. Teachers began using George's posts in their classes to discuss empathy and resilience. Child psychologists noted that having a peer, even a royal one, acknowledge the challenges of childhood illness was helping young patients feel less alone. But perhaps the most significant change in George's life wasn't public at all. The shy, nervous boy who had once dreaded public attention had developed a quiet confidence that impressed everyone around him. Mrs. Henderson noticed that he approached his regular lessons with more focus and curiosity, particularly when they studied subjects related to public service and social issues. His relationship with his siblings had also evolved. Charlotte and Louis, initially awed by their brother's newfound fame, began to see him as a role model, rather than just an older brother. They started asking if they could visit hospitals with him, leading to the heartwarming sight of all three royal children playing games with young patients. One afternoon, while visiting a hospital in Manchester, George encountered a situation that would test everything he had learned about leadership and compassion. He was playing chess with a 13-year-old boy named Daniel, who had been battling a rare form of bone cancer for over a year. Daniel was unusually quiet during their game, and George could sense that something was troubling him beyond his illness. "Is everything okay?" George asked gently. Daniel hesitated before speaking. "Prince George, can I ask you something? Do you ever wonder if you're going to die?" The question caught George off guard. In all his hospital visits, children had shared their fears, their hopes, and their dreams, but none had asked him so directly about mortality. George thought carefully before answering. "I think about it sometimes," he said honestly. "Especially since my great-grandmother died. But I've learned from kids like you that thinking about dying isn't the same as giving up on living." Daniel nodded slowly. "The doctors told my parents yesterday that my treatment isn't working as well as they hoped. They're going to try something new, but they can't promise it will work." George felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he knew Daniel needed him to be strong. "That must be really scary," George said. "It is, but you know what's weird? I'm not as scared as I thought I would be. Meeting you and hearing about all the other brave kids has made me feel like I'm part of something bigger. Like even if the worst happens, my story matters too." George struggled to find the right words. "Daniel, your story absolutely matters. You've been fighting this disease with more courage than most adults could manage. Win or lose, you're already a hero." Daniel smiled for the first time during their conversation. "Will you remember me, even if I don't make it?" "I'll remember you," George promised, and he meant it with all his heart. 3 months later, George received news that Daniel had passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family. The loss hit him harder than he expected. For the first time since beginning his hospital visits, he questioned whether he was strong enough for this role. His mother found him crying in his room that evening. "It's not fair," George said through his tears. "Daniel was so brave, so smart, he should have gotten better." Catherine held her son close. "You're right. It's not fair. Losing someone you care about never is. But George, think about what Daniel told you. He said meeting you made him feel part of something bigger. You gave him comfort in his last months. That matters enormously." George wiped his eyes and looked at his mother. "Will it always hurt this much when I lose someone I care about?" "Yes," Catherine said honestly, "but that's how you know you're doing this for the right reasons. The pain means you really care, and caring is what makes you a good leader." At Daniel's funeral, George delivered a eulogy that moved everyone present. He spoke about Daniel's love of chess, his sense of humor, and his determination to keep learning even when he was sick. But mostly he talked about what Daniel had taught him about courage. "Daniel showed me that being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid," George said to the packed church. "Being brave means you keep caring about others even when you're scared." Daniel worried about his parents, he encouraged other patients, and he never stopped hoping for a better tomorrow. "He was 13 years old, and he taught me things about life that some people never learn." The funeral became a turning point for George. The grief he felt over losing Daniel deepened his commitment to helping other children facing similar battles. He began spending even more time at hospitals, not just as a visiting royal, but as someone who genuinely understood the preciousness and fragility of life. A year after his first speech, George was invited to address the United Nations International Day of Children's Rights. Standing before delegates from around the world, he spoke with the same authenticity that had characterized his first speech, but with a maturity earned through genuine experience. "Last year, I was terrified to give my first public speech," he began. "I was worried about saying the wrong thing, about not being important enough to deserve people's attention. But the children I've met since then have taught me that importance isn't about titles or positions. Importance comes from seeing others, caring about their struggles, and never giving up on the belief that every person's story matters." He went on to share stories from his hospital visits, always focusing on the children's courage rather than their illnesses. He spoke about Emma's garden, Marcus's determination to keep playing sports, Sophie's artwork, and Daniel's wisdom about courage. "These children have taught me that childhood shouldn't be defined by what happens to you, but by how you respond to what happens to you. They've shown me that even in the darkest circumstances, hope can grow, friendships can flourish, and love can triumph. As George concluded his address to the United Nations, he looked out at the sea of adult faces before him and thought about all the children whose stories had brought him to this moment. My great-grandmother once told me that serving others is the rent we pay for the space we occupy on Earth. The children I've met have shown me that this rent is not a burden to be carried, but a privilege to be embraced. They've taught me that real leadership isn't about having power over others, but about using whatever power you have to lift others up. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but George barely noticed. He was thinking about Emma's garden, about Marcus's next football match, about Sophie's latest drawing, and about Daniel's chess strategy that he would never get to finish. These children had transformed a frightened boy into a young man who understood his purpose in the world. The nervous 10-year-old who had once trembled at the thought of public speaking had found his voice by learning to listen. The prince who had worried about being worthy of his title had discovered that worthiness comes not from birth or position, but from the sincere desire to serve others. As George left the United Nations that day, he carried with him the voices of all the children who had taught him what courage really means. Their stories had become part of his story, and their strength had become his strength. The boy who had once feared disappointing others had learned that the greatest disappointment would be failing to use his voice for those who needed to be heard. George's first speech had indeed left the nation in tears, but more importantly, it had awakened a young leader who would spend his life ensuring that no child's courage would go unrecognized, no family's struggle would go unnoticed, and no act of kindness would go uncelebrated. The frightened boy had become a beacon of hope, and his story was just beginning.